This Talking Flutes podcast is kindly sponsored by Trevor James Flutes, making life sound beautiful. You can show them some flute love by following them on Instagram at TJ Flutes, Trevor James Flutes on Facebook, and at trevorjamesflutes.com. Hello everybody and welcome this week to Talking Flutes Extra with me, Jean-Paul Wright. This week our guest is a really lovely man and fabulous flute player whom I first met, it must be several years ago now, Dr Rik Noyce. An altus flutes performing artist, he's had a varied and visible career as a professional musician, university professor and is a certified life coach. He is also a co-founder and faculty member of Whole Musician, a team of specially certified musicians who empower performers to realise their full artistic power and expression, who empower performers to realise their full artistic power and expression. Along with his many musical and academic accomplishments, Dr. Noyce has been coaching people's lives for nearly 20 years and is a certified life coach by the International Coach Federation. Specialising in working with performing artists, he has coached several hundreds of people from all walks of life with time management, productivity, creative blocks, stage fright and performance anxiety. Thanks to modern technology, he is able, and check this out, you lovely listeners, to work with people around the world via video chat and phone. So everybody, may I proffer, and that's a great word, proffer, isn't it? A warm English welcome via Zoom to the other side of the proverbial pond in California, currently sitting in California, to the wonderful Dr. Rik Noyce. Hi, Rik.
Hello, Jean-Paul. Thanks so much for having me. It's really marvelous to see you, and it's been a long, long while.
It has been a long while. And, I preface this by just saying you are everyone who knows you knows that you're a genuinely lovely and gentle guy. And as a wonderful flute player, it seems to be you leave your ego parked at the door when you come out with your flute, and it's just this very peaceful, tranquil guy, which is unusual for a musician, isn't it?
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I think that could be unusual for a lot of us musicians. It might even be unusual for me, but I'm so lovely that so happy that you think so lovely of me. That's really quite astonishing to hear. I think, honestly, that I probably carry along with me everything that everybody else does. But interesting to me that your experience doesn't show those things when I'm playing or I'm around. I'm really grateful to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we need to have a persona on the stage, and I do understand that. But
Sure.
But for most of us as musicians, well, I don't class myself as a musician anymore. I'm just too old for that. I just make a noise on the tube and just hope one day that people come in and listen. But no, seeing you play and seeing your other wonderful members of the Whole Musician play, you just play with sort of complete freedom, but you have this ability to unlock a narrative. And the narrative isn't about you playing on the stage or each of you playing on the stage. So I'll talk about you now, you on the stage, but it's about the music that you're playing. Now, how do you manage to unlock yourself from that particular narrative?
Wow. Again, thank you for that. It's really extraordinary to hear. I think that unlocking that potential is a constant work, and that neither I or any of my colleagues sort of were born with any special traits that allowed these things to be. That this is a constant conversation that we're having with ourselves and frankly with one another as support. One of the things I would say, I think there's so many different ways for us to go here, but one of the things I would say is having a check-in system, a support system is so essential for, I think, any human being, but particularly anyone who's a performing artist of any kind. Even the best of us with the best training, I think, will often, slip into old habits and old paradigms. And sometimes we just need that great friend to be able to say, hey, look over here. That is not what you're potentially feeling right now, or what you're saying about yourself right now isn't necessarily true. And if you can, readjust, in coaching, we call that reframing. If you can reframe that to a place where, you can find power and strength and assuredness in that, then that changes everything about your being. It changes everything about you in that moment. And therefore, it changes everything about your performance, what you're standing on stage trying to portray. So, that idea of that there's a narrative, and it's not about, showmanship or a persona per se. Yeah, I think we do all have a persona on stage, and I think that's born out of seeds of who we are. I don't actually think that, let me say it this way. I remember in my training, one of the things that really just shocked me into a new reality was the idea that in order for me to recognize something in someone else, they're a wonderful player, or they're so kind, or they're, whatever attribute it might be, which we often then put outside of us and onto those people, right? That's them. But in order for us to recognize anything like that in someone else, it is because we ourselves embody that. We are that. If we weren't that ourselves, it would be oblivious to us in someone else. And I think that really, really changed things for me. That if I can see someone who is telling a wonderful story through their playing, or is touching people, or is less concerned about, I don't know, playing it the right way, whatever, I'll use air quotes around the word right. If we can get outside of that and just start to, and see that, wow, that's really touching, that's moving. The only reason I can recognize and appreciate that is because I've got that in me to do the same. And so then my day-to-day job, I guess, becomes reminding myself of that, so that I can bring that, with my voice to stage. Does that make any sense?
No, absolutely. And it's beginning that process of understanding yourself, which is actually very hard for a musician, because you're trying desperately to understand the notes on the page and understand how you're supposed to be developing each note and the sound of each note, and then the mathematical equation, which is the mathematical equation of the dots on the page.
Yeah.
But you literally have to have an out-of-body experience, as you're saying, to be able to understand what you're trying to put over to the audience. So yes, that came over really well.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I remember, early on, my teacher in my undergraduate, he said something to me that was utterly shocking. And frankly, as my young 18-year-old self, was quite offended. But I really got this. It was after preparing for, I can't remember now what I want to. I remember afterwards being just so happy because I got through it. And, I had essentially, played all the right notes at the right time. And I had played in tune, and I had, done the hairpins as they were marked. And sort of talking with my teacher around that, saying, how excited I was, he gave me a comeuppance. And he said, well, that's great, but don't go celebrate, because you don't get to celebrate playing the right notes at the right time. That's the baseline. That's the basic job.
I love that, Rik. I love that. Don't celebrate if you play the right notes in the right time with the right hairpins. That's quite potentially a sterile performance, isn't it?
Exactly. And this is precisely what he was trying to impart.
Okay.
Is that following the ink, following the dots and the squiggles and the lines is just simply reading like you would read a book without, enveloping it and understanding it. The art comes when you put your voice in. The art comes when you change the spin of your vibrato, when you change the direction of something, when you have made up a story in your mind. It goes along with that phrase of, absolute music, no program at all, but this is the story I've said that goes along with this. And that's where the art comes.
So as a life coach, I like the word life coach, because you're not just teaching or opening up. So you don't teach, you open up parts, the facets of the human person within. When you're standing in front of a student that is struggling to interpret and is struggling to open up, how would you just get them to relax to enable the musicality to come through?
Well, I think that there isn't necessarily one way to do that, Jean-Paul.
I agree. No, I agree.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I think the idea of coach, which you brought a point to, I think is really also important, because as life coaches, we are very rooted in that you are the expert in your life.
Yep.
It's not for me to tell you. It's not for me to describe to you a series of rules to follow.
Mm-hmm.
You know you. I am just here to guide you and let you observe and let you make some informed decisions. So with that sort of being the paradigm, then when I take this to my flute studio, when I take that there, I work with my students in trying to uncover for them what is happening. So, it opens up a series of possibilities of what might be stopping them, right? Are they in their head of nervousness? And if so, what is that nervousness being caused from? And so, it is very different. So I don't mean to obfuscate that question so much, but I have trouble maybe outlining a set of rules that I would follow, or a set of recipe I'd follow with a student on that.
Do you know, I realized that after I'd said it, that it was, there's a student standing on the stage and there's no way, and without asking them some very personal details in front of the whole audience, would you then be able to change anything? I realized that after I'd asked the question.
Well, and also this is marvelous, though. I think that that's one of the things that we as musicians, certainly those of us who teach, and I particularly feel that this is seriously in need in higher education, which is really why I became a life coach, was less about me spinning off into that career and making, a full career just coaching people, but was to bring that paradigm shift to higher education. And that was really one of my big goals there. So I think that one of the things that we all have probably experienced is that very close personal relationship we often can create with a primary instructor.
Yes.
That's different than, I took history with you for a semester, right? I've got you every week one-on-one for an hour for 3, 4, 5 years. Right. So I think it does allow, with full and conscious and choices and conversation, but it does allow a connection that then can have these questions be asked where you wouldn't, do this in a master class per se, right, in front of people on a stage. So I think that is something that we create. When it comes to like nervousness and stuff like that, I'm just going to turn it around on me, because it's hard for me to get into the head of every potential student out there, right? But I'll tell you, even still to this day, which is, I think, is so marvelous, that the way you started with your impression of how it is that when you hear me play, I will tell you that the truth of the matter is, to this day, I'm an absolute nervous wreck.
Really?
And walking out onto stage, I am absolutely terrified and horrified until I played my first 4 or 5 notes. And then I'm like, oh, okay. But, so I think that this, and I think that there's something really human about that. And I think, that, again, that kind of goes to, it doesn't really necessarily matter how long we've been doing it or how well trained we are, even in all these ancillary things like life coaching and, meditation and all these different ideas. We are still going to click into our root being, and my root being, honestly, is to be actually kind of quiet and reserved, even though that may not be what it is when I'm out with people. I think that's where I go. So the idea of walking out on stage and seeing 250 people out there, and now I'm about to play Pulong, I'm kind of, why me, And then I have my techniques I go through. One of the first things that I really do, and I think of honestly, is breathing. And I think that breathing is just so essential. We talk about it all different forms. And certainly as wind players, we're always talking about breathing the right way to breathe, and, to breathe all around, to expand the body and the lung. I take a more simplistic approach to it. And I think of it as if I were coming into the end of a meditation, and maybe in a group situation, all came together and let out a terrific big om. And that sound that is produced, of course, is healing. But the act of creating that sound is actually what is healing. And it's the expulsion of concerted, thoughtful air leaving us. This is my wacky thought on this, but this is how I think about that. So I really try to think about, and I talk to my students about the idea of what if, rather than that being associated with meditation, what if the act of playing your flute was your om? What if that expulsion of air was just as comforting and relaxing as om at the end of a meditation? And I try to remind myself of that. And usually by the second breath of a performance, I'm good. Because of that.
That's a real mega reframe, that, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a very different take. I get that. And I'm certain that, this could bring up a lot of conversation to the contrary. But, listen, I think it works. At least it has for me. And I've watched it really work with a bunch of students. They get through that first phrase and maybe they're kind of rough and then they've got a measure or two out and you can just see them take a breath, blow out, and then they take another breath to play. So, I think there's something there that's really simple to put on. That concerted breathing reserved for a meditative, quiet space. Why can't that just be what we do all day long?
A performance versus experience. As a mature individual, I think I'm probably a lot older than you, Rik, but as mature individuals...
I'm not so sure.
You look a hell of a lot younger than I do. It's the beard that does it on me. As you get older, you have lots of life experiences. A lot of life experiences that you can draw on, providing you know the narrative, the story you're playing as a musician. How do you, as a coach, try and inform, or I wouldn't say unlock, because a lot of the experiences they wouldn't have had, how hard is it to get them to perform without that previous experience? I'm only saying that is because when I was 18, I was asked by one of my flute teacher at the time, George Crozier, had I ever been in love? And I said, well, I don't really think so. I'm an 18-year-old guy. Don't think I've been in love. And he said, well, the day that you've been in love, you'll be able to play this piece properly.
Wow.
And the day you've had your heart broken, then you'll be able to play other pieces that is about brokenheartedness. It's not about a dot. The story is within the dots. And
Yeah.
I didn't really get it at the time, but I do get it now. So as a teacher, if you're playing, if some music is about heartbreak, you've got to be very careful, haven't you? Certainly as a coach, that you don't want to unlock something in the student that is going to remind them of a heartbreak in their life, do you?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for sharing that story. Because I hear interesting things in there. I don't necessarily disagree. To have had that experience in life of love or tremendous heartbreak, really does then become applicable and something we can rely on when we go to play. I guess I immediately, though, and no offense to your teacher, but I got really stuck on the idea then that to actually be able to play this piece was now somehow having to be stuck on the shelf and wait 20 years
Absolutely.
before you could actually do that.
Yeah.
I find that sad.
Odd, yes.
Yeah, I think this is where I would diverge with your teacher. Where I agree that, once you've been in love or had tremendous heartbreak or whatever, that will inform and change your performance. I don't think that means a young person can't somehow relate to those things, because it's still about what we have in our experience. And even if we're only 18 or 20 years old, we've still had something that equaled love to us, or something that equaled heartbreak to us. Now, what that might be when we're 40, of course, is likely to be different, but that doesn't make it any less valid or any less weighty in that young person's life.
Interesting, Rik. I told this to a friend of mine years ago, and he said, well, most people would have experienced love by the time they're 6, 7, 8, because you have the love of your parents. But you also have a dog, or a cat, or a fish, or a rabbit. So you can draw from, as you've just said, you can draw from other angles.
Yeah. The only way to interpret, Undine, for instance, is through romantic love, then I think a whole bunch of us are doomed. We're not going to be able to play that for quite some time, or perhaps ever, right? And so I think it's really important that we reframe a situation to think. And so to kind of go back to your question, I think I seek that out in working with students, so that I can find where they are. And I'm very blessed that I'm working with university age students, so really my youngest are, 18, 19. But so that there's still a good bit of, you still got the better part of 2 decades of life there. A lot has transpired. And I find, interestingly, I'll just use an example, that sometimes especially now, I had three thoughts go through my head at the same time. Let me qualify this, especially now, 2 years after the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and us being on high alert for this time. This is an exhausting way of living that we were never intended to be. We were not intended to be on fight or flight mode, nonstop for 2 years. So I think that is impacting students, and that even, what might not have been so upsetting earlier with big technical passage or something is now just surfacing very quickly as frustration and often tears. There's a big box of Kleenex on the piano in my studio, because it's not uncommon for there to be tears. And not to frighten people off, it's not because Rik Noyce is a mean old doctor who is going to make you all feel bad, but I think that in working with really tapping in and creating art, you've got to tap into you. And in tapping into you, surfacing, what's going to surface then is all of the stuff. And right now we all have a lot of stuff. I am very comfortable with someone in tears, and very comfortable with them going through their process. I don't swoop in and jump in to try and make it all better. I let them be in their emotion. But while they're in that emotion, I talk to them about that phrase, or I talk to them about what's going on in this piece, and say, great, right now, what you're doing here that's coming out in tears, put that through your flute. And, it's tough. You can't play flute very well while you're sobbing. But once you can kind of grab hold of that, it's amazing what starts to come out of the students. And they have a new interpretation for what we would have in previous times say, have you ever been in love? That's how you should play Undine, right? Now we've got a different connection to that. And I think that really has made a profound difference for a lot of my students.
Yeah, so unlocking emotions, yes, I understand that's a very personal thing, and it will take a very dedicated and understanding and experienced teacher to be able to manage that. And it is a dangerous passage for anyone to go down in a teaching process if you don't know what you're going to do if a student does break down, because that is quite an unusual occurrence, because what you don't want to do is get involved in the process of why they've broken down.
Yeah. And of course, I think, obviously things have changed also so very much, from the old paradigm of, the teacher and, just play it and nope, that's not right, fix it, not even necessarily telling you what to do, right? Just like, fix it, play it again. And, that kind of thing, whatever, I need help with my double tongue. Well, just practice it. Those were kind of things that many of us have experienced in the past. And so there was sort of a separation of, we're here to get the business of the work of music done. And while I don't necessarily disagree that that's what we're doing in a lesson, I think that is too constrained of an approach, and that we can't, as human beings, get the work of art done if we're in turmoil. And until we understand, even just briefly, what that turmoil is, and then find a way to harness that and use that, then it's worth it. Then it's awesome. Right. But I think that probably a lot of teachers are uncomfortable with that conversation, or don't feel equipped for this conversation. I don't know that I did. And that's partly why I then took the time to go become a certified life coach so that I would feel more equipped. So
I think a big part of it is also an understanding from everybody that we're all flawed, we're not perfect, and we should never hold others up and aim to do what others do, because you could look at a really brilliant flute player. You could look at one of my favorites, Denis Burikov, just down the road from you. Absolutely stunning player. And you may want to be like Dennis, but you don't know how hard he's had to work to get there. You don't know what's going on in his life. It may look like it's all champagne and roses and picks the flute up and just plays like a god, but you don't know what's going on. So I think it's understanding your own flaws, isn't it? And then working with it and knowing that every performance is valid.
Yeah. No, you've hit on so many really important things there, Jean-Paul. We don't necessarily, like you said, Dennis, who just amazing. I'm blessed to live in LA and get to hear Dennis with regularity. It's just awe-inspiring. But as you said, you don't necessarily know what has happened to get him to that point, and that just absoluteness and it's so correct and so beautiful and so emotional, and it's everything all in that package. We often can find that part of that conversation more easily than I think we can find the other side of that. And I think the other side has just as much, if I might even argue more, validity. And that comes from looking at a great person like Dennis and not understanding, what they might have done to do there. But what happens when we start looking at somebody who, quote unquote, doesn't have that same stature, right? Who's not the principal of the Los Angeles Philharmonic and all of those kinds of bars that we have decided in society are very, very particularly meaningful. And I think that's where students, and particularly hobby, amateur, players who are playing for fun, really, really can find inspiration and movement in their lives, is to say, what I am going through, what I've done while, doing all the other things in my life has brought me to being able to play this like this. And this is why this is valid. And here's what I am offering. And you know what? The people out there don't know what I'm going through either. And I think that we don't always have that opportunity to think like that. We think only about the famous people and how perfect they are. Again, not one of my favorite words, but how perfect they are in their performances, and therefore I must be like this. I must emulate Dennis or whoever it is. And while those are beautiful goals, they're flawed in that they squelch our voice, they squelch our being, and we simply are trying to emulate someone else. And my mind right now goes to one of my favorite authors, and I'm certain him very well, Don Miguel Ruiz and the Four Agreements.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's just where my mind goes as I'm talking about this, because, those basic four agreements, well, maybe we shouldn't assume everybody knows what they are. But the first one is be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally.
Yep.
Don't make assumptions, and always do your best. And there's actually one that I love too, that people often don't know. The series was later updated to have a fifth agreement. And that fifth agreement was to be skeptical, but be willing to listen. Isn't it amazing? And, when you start to really think about that, I'll just go all the way back to being impeccable with our word. Listen, this is huge. Really, really, really huge. And when it comes to us as individuals and musicians and what we're trying to create, our word is everything. And I think that, again, often what happens is we have a somewhat narrow scope of what we're talking about when we're talking about our word. Our word starts between our ears as our thought. Right. And that's just as powerful, even prior to, making the air vibrate with our lips as we say the word. Right. And so, speaking with integrity and saying only what it is that you really mean, that would really put most of us in check if we really just tried to do that for 1 hour, let alone one day. Right. And, listen, you and I have, I think, a little bit of a personality similarity. Is there's a little bit of a self-deprecation that comes along with us. And I heard, we heard you earlier about, you just, blow into the tube and you don't really consider yourself a musician any longer and stuff. And I absolutely understand that. And I grew up too to sort of, think that self-deprecation was a humility and a kindness and a good way of being. And while that may be the case, it's also a lie. Jean-Paul, you're one of the most brilliant musicians I know. You're a beautiful player, and when we start to really think about our words, even something as simple as that, how our paradigm shifts, how our life shifts when we think about that. When I have to really grapple with the fact that, I'm not a flute fraud, which, by the way, I lived for years and years and years and years. I have a very circuitous route to becoming a flutist. As a young kid, I started as a percussionist, as a drummer in, fourth grade band. And I did that for several years and honestly wasn't thrilled with it. I did great, but, I was advancing quickly and playing a lot of rhythms and it wasn't inspiring me. So I asked my parents to switch instruments and I became an oboist. So in 7th grade, I started playing oboe. And I studied oboe for years, and through high school in Boston, I was studying at New England Conservatory Extension Division, and I was doing all this oboe stuff and loving it. But, I was also in high school and marching band and things. You can't march with an oboe, so I needed to do something. So my band director gave me an alto saxophone, said, go see what you can do. Well, I learned alto saxophone and utterly hated it. No offense to my sax friends out there, but it was just wasn't for me. And so the following year, over summer, I knew band camp was coming and marching season was coming again. And so I taught myself flute so that I could play flute and enjoy that. And I was to be an oboist. I played flute for fun. And in my time at Hart, I had the most extraordinary ukulele who literally changed my life. As he was my oboe teacher, literally changed my life in so many ways. He was one of the only people who encouraged me to do all of the things that would speak to me musically, where everyone else was like, if you don't only play the oboe, eat, sleep, breathe, and drink oboe, you will never be serious. You will never know what you're doing. You'll never succeed. That was the story I was getting from most, not my teacher. My teacher was like, you play flute for fun, so play flute in band. So, I thought, well, if I'm lucky, these are all music majors. If I'm lucky, maybe I'll get to sit last chair flute in the wind ensemble, the band at school. I got first flute, second chair, self-taught player, right? So the flute fraud thing, completely living underneath my skin the whole time. Right. And then he also encouraged me to sing. And I sang all through college. I still sing to this day. So, all of that informed my musicianship. All of that informed me as a player. So, fast forward years ahead, actually is what brought me to California was oboe. I got full scholarship to come study at USC. And moved 3,000 plus miles across the country in my little Volkswagen and came out to do my master's degree at USC. And I did it for only about a year. Didn't finish that degree because it wasn't resonating. It wasn't right. It just wasn't working. So then I went and did other things and, survived and worked and stuff like that. And then it was just a couple of years after that I, through a very emotional conversation with my old roommate from back east, just talked about that what I always wanted to do was flute, always. And there was a series of environmental, family paradigms that caused me to be afraid to ask to do that. When I grew up, that was considered the instrument for young girls and boys shouldn't play that. And that was something that I understood and various things. I won't get into too much personal stuff, but it didn't allow me to feel comfortable asking to do that. I got away with it because, I needed it for marching band. But then I'd go back to oboe. And no one knew what an oboe was. So I was pretty safe there, right? That was my young brain. So flash forward all these years later, and I just, through heartfelt thing, realizing what I always wanted to do was be a flutist, but I hadn't even taken a lesson yet. I was self-taught. No, I played all around LA. I played in all the churches. I already played in the cathedral. I did all this kind of stuff, but it was, I taught myself what to do, and I came at it like an oboe player. So my sound is different because I have a different thought about how, the kind of sound I want to make and all of that. So through all of that, my friend encouraged me to, just go ahead, be a flute player. So I launched my first recital ever as a flute player, just, rented a church space, hired an accompanist, and put on my recital. And that started my life as actually a flutist. And it was some years after that I decided it was time for me to go back to school and complete the degree. And that's where the next major teacher who utterly changed my life came into my life. And I can't be more grateful. And that was Dave Shostak. And I owe my life to David Shostak for being as a flutist. He didn't care about any of that circuitous route. He knew me from around town. He knew my commitment, and he said he was thrilled to bring me on as a student. So I went back to school. I'm now at a master's level with never having had a flute lesson. And I started studying with David, and that is, that's my story, doctorate and all that kind of stuff.
This is new to me, Rik. You've come really from the school of hard knocks, haven't you? So can I ask one question then? Because you're talking about flute frauders in the previous year. Imposter syndrome. Because you've come through the route you have, and I know lots of people, and that's not necessarily, I know people listening to this podcast aren't necessarily flute players, but are very good in their field, but yet they have imposter syndrome.
Sure.
So coming through the route you have, yes, you've come through the flute route eventually, but you didn't start that way. How do you deal? Obviously, you're going to have to go through your own experience with imposter syndrome when it sort of bubbles to the surface.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think that's very likely. I have to go back a little earlier when, you were asking about nervousness. And I said, still to this day, I walk out on stage, still freaking out until I begin to play. I'm quite certain that the seed of that is my own flute fraud or my own imposter syndrome, right? Because in the back of my head, I didn't start playing flute at 4 years in fourth grade, and I haven't played flute my whole life. And so I'm behind, and I'm still at this point in my life, right? I'm behind, and I don't make the same kind of sound that everybody else makes, and so that people are going to interpret that as wrong. And I've had people tell me those things, so that it kind of supported my worst fears, right? So that gave me the empirical evidence, that I wasn't good enough and I was a fraud. So the managing of that, though, I think really comes down to really understanding who I am and what it is that I'm doing. And for me, and unfortunately, I think this is, at least for me in my life, this is an issue of time and age. I didn't have this as a young person. But for me, it's really having to remind myself constantly that my unique voice is enough. My interpretation of this piece is different than, said flutist. And that is not only okay, that is actually wanted. And in getting to that point of understanding that, because I play differently or, don't have the glorious pedigree of maybe some other people who started when they were quite young, doesn't change or invalidate what I present. At the end of the day, my barometer is, have I done my job? And what I think my job is to reach in, grab your heart, and to give it a squeeze. And if I've managed to do that, even if it's, not the perfect flute sound, or it's, I took that foray, 2 metronomic markings slower than, the people think, or whatever that might be. I come away saying I've done my work, and I've done what I am here to do, is to move people, to cause feelings and emotions, to cause connection for people. And ultimately that causes change. And that causes change on our planet. It might be micro, but a lot of micro movements become macro.
Butterfly effect, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I hope that's not too, lofty of a dream in the way I'm speaking it. That's really the only way I get through. And again, also tremendous support from friends. I'm not kidding you. It was just like a couple of weeks ago, I had a long conversation with my colleague, Christopher Lee, because I was in a tough place and I wasn't so sure about something I had just put out there. And, having to talk with him through this and be reminded of what I just said. So, like I said, I think for me, that comes back down to management, not eradication of that imposter syndrome or flute fraudiness, as I call it.
Do you know, the reason I ask that is I have it, and a lot of the people, my close friends, have it, and they've got major jobs in the City of London, and some days they just feel as though they don't know why they're there. So it happens to everybody, and you're exactly right. It's the managing of it and knowing that, A, you're doing your best, but B, that you have an input, you're changing something for the good. And it doesn't matter if you work in a bank, it doesn't matter if you're a musician, it doesn't matter if you're a teacher or a nurse or a doctor. What you're doing is doing something for good. And You're exactly right. Can I go off on a tangent, Rik? One thing that really, it's a big thing for me. You wake up in the morning, right? And you've had a sleep. Well, obviously you've had a sleep, you've just woken up. That's a bit daft of me to say that, wasn't it? Right, you go and look at yourself in the mirror and you're not feeling great. What is your routine in the morning? Right. So obviously you go and get a shower, whatever it is, but how do you start the day to put the rest of your day into a positive context? Because you are a positive person and you find ways of, even if there's a negativity there, you will reframe it. I'll use that word you started with, reframe it to actually get a positive from it. A lot of people find it really hard. And I'm not talking about someone that is sort of medically depressed or clinically depressed, but most of us in mundane lives, you get up and you're not feeling it. But I get the point. I get the feeling with you. You will try and find a positive step to sort of springboard you into the day. So it's my roundabout question is, what do you do?
Yeah, well, I think I hope you won't be disappointed, because I think it's wholly unremarkable. I mean, were you to actually observe me getting up in my morning, I think you'd probably laugh out loud. I literally blurry-eyed stumbled to the kitchen and start the coffee. Yes, it is literally the first thing that I do. And I've got the most glorious coffee maker that makes the most fabulous lattes, and that is a must. Like, that is I must begin. And it's so interesting that you say this, because even my pets understand this routine, because when I wake, they follow me. I have 2 little dogs and a cat, and they all follow me out to the kitchen and sort of just hover while the machine is doing its thing. And then we all walk to my den and sit down on the couch, and all 3 of them sort of saddle up. One's in my lap and one's on each side of me. We all 3 saddle up together, and we just sit and we just be. And I literally don't speak or do or anything in particular for a good 20 to 25 minutes. I just be. I'm very blessed that our beautiful little house here has a wonderful little courtyard. So I see out to the courtyard. So I see the morning sun coming in, and it's hitting a plant in the courtyard. I can see the backyard from there. And it's just really an incredible experience to just be and wake up and be with whatever it is that I'm experiencing for that morning, and think about how I want to set my intentions. And it's not until I've actually just been quiet that I then worry about what shall be my agenda? What's going to be my thought process today? What do I need to put into check? Maybe I'm feeling badly about today. I want to, do something about. I just allow myself to be. And I suppose that can be dangerous because some days, allowing myself to be means that I'm sad or I'm uncomfortable or things going on in life have me worried or concerned. And so rather than trying to immediately thrust that away, I let myself steep in that. If I'm sad, then okay, then let's be sad. And let's really know what it is to be sad for a while and understand that that's okay and that's informing me. And then I can, through that information, decide what it is I wish to do with it, that information. Okay, so I'm sad today. Now, what would I like to do? How would I like my life to look? How would I like to impact others?
For me, what's important with that, and I'm going to have to have you back on because you and I need to talk about being present and having time for yourself and just being.
Oh, I love
because that. So it's a passion of mine, as you know, and I know it's a passion of yours too. But that's a subject in itself. But what I like the fact is that you've brought up the subject of not batting emotion away because that emotion is real, that emotion is genuine, and it's how you're feeling now. By pushing it away, you're putting it in a pressure cooker and it'll come back at another time in a way that you're sitting with it. You're not doing anything with it. You're sitting with it and then you can just let it dissipate and move on. So we have another wonderful podcast to do. You're an expert in this and I want to learn things. I want to learn things.
I'd be thrilled and absolutely honored. Yeah. I mean, I could talk about this stuff all day. I don't know that, I have the magic pill, but I think that talking about it is in and of itself what we need. I think although times have changed and we are so much better about this now than I think in the not so distant past, I think we still are sometimes afraid of our emotions and we seek to not feel upset or not feel sad. And while I completely understand that, it's uncomfortable. Listen, it's uncomfortable by design, right? I completely understand that, but I don't think that the response ought to be just ridding ourselves of it.
No, that's my view as well. People have therapy and it's all about understanding the emotion and not pushing it away because it is part of who you are at that moment and you can learn from it and you can heal from it. And yeah, this is a separate podcast, but I'd love to feed off you on this.
Well, and sort of the final point here, not only do we learn and heal from all of this, but this is the fodder of the art. You just brought us back so artfully all the way to the beginning of this conversation because this is what everyone's looking for. This is how we started this, is how do you interpret and how do we make it? Well, it's here. It's right here. I've got to be okay with being upset if I want to portray upset in music. I can't wait to the next time.
That's going to be brilliant. And the last subject, what people won't know is that unusually for me, because I normally start with a small script, but I roughly know where I'm going on questions. What I'd like to finish on is affirmations and affirmations that you give yourself and the importance of affirmations in one's life. Because I don't think people as we do it enough to ourselves. We like to be self-critical, and that self-critical little person that sits on our shoulders and whispers in our ears, but yet we don't take time for affirmations.
I must be honest and let you know that I've also had, I think much of my life is circuitous. And so I've had a circuitous route with affirmations as well, honestly. And I would tell you, initially, the concept of affirmations was absolute hogwash to me. Mm-hmm. I took it to an extreme. I not only found them perhaps silly or not useful, I found them just utterly ridiculous and lies. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't, in my young brain, be with saying, positive things about myself when I wasn't feeling those positive things were true. I was just lying to myself. And how could that possibly be helpful? This is a bunch of garbage. I now look back on that, Rick, and say, oh, bless your heart. It really shows that you you didn't quite understand it. You didn't quite get it. I now feel differently about affirmations. And I think, again, this comes down to speaking carefully, truth, and being conscious of being impeccable with your word again, right? So we want to really be thoughtful about what we say in affirmation. But the other thing for me around affirmation is really making certain that what it is that you're speaking is not I want, but is in effect I'm an I am. Because when we're wanting something, that by the very nature of that word is outside of us and distant from us. And that's why my young self thought that this was hogwash and didn't make any sense, because right now I'm mad, I'm upset, whatever, I'm not being inspiring and I'm not an inspiring person, right? I mean, like they were incongruous. So for me, affirmations are about stating the I am. Now, it could be a desired I am, but really coming from the place of the I am. And how I look at doing that is interesting. Again, here we come full circle back to that idea of being able to recognize something in somebody else is only possible because I have that trait myself. I am that trait. So inside that, I really try to think about affirmations as what is possible outside of me? What is possible on the planet? What is possible for others? Because if inspiration and passionate expression is possible for a great flutist, then I want to be in the space of being that is possible. And this is perhaps a little heady of a concept, but it's not that I want inspiration to be possible for people, but I'm actually a stand that inspiration is a thing and it's possible for us all. And that's part of my, probably my morning, right? My quiet morning is, sort of sitting in, if I'm going to use those examples, if I'm inspiration and passionate expression, if I'm that can be possible in the planet, then that is the affirmation of who I am. And then how can I go throughout my day being a negative Nancy if I'm the possibility that inspiration exists for people? Like that's an incongruency that actually kills off the negativity.
The I want is never something that should be created into a personal affirmation. I've said it on a previous podcast. I always end my meditations in the morning with a great thing that Pema Chodron once said on a retreat, which was, I am not my thoughts are impermanent. And for me, because when our thoughts bubble up, sometimes we grab hold of that thought and then we sort of manifest on it, and then we go down this dead end, don't we, in this alley. And I like to know that if a thought bubbles up, then I am not necessarily that thought. And it all goes back to my affirmations are just like yours in that I never say I want. And interestingly, I came from exactly the same field with positive affirmations. I hated them because I'm English. I grew up in England, and then you get the great Tony Robbins. Yes, you can do it. Let's go for it. I can, I will, I'll do it. You can be anything you want if you want to be it. And the truth is, you can't. You can just be what you can be. And it doesn't harm. And it's very important that we aim high, but we shouldn't aim high enough that we end up with a negativity on what we're doing. So I end up exactly the same place as you. I love affirmations now because it's all to do that I am rather than I want. And also, if someone says, be positive. Well, if I'm feeling crap, I can't be positive. So however many times I say, be positive.
Well, and there's probably some similarity because you're English, but I'm from New England. So there are probably similarities. I mean, listen, some of my Boston accent sounds an awful lot like your English accent.
It does, yes.
That brings me also the idea that, you said you can only be what you can be, right? I know that might ruffle some feathers out there in the world, but again, affirming and saying I will fly is, just not happening. and I know that seems like an extreme example, but taking that down one notch to say, that I am reasonable things. And we have to be cautious with this. I really I understand that, because reasonable is usually filled with a whole lot of pre-described limitations that aren't actually real. So I get what Tony Robbins and other people are saying, and I agree. But, we want to shoot high, but you want to go for being complete in your intention. So I'm reminded of the terrible words I made reference to earlier today that I hated is the word perfect.
Yep.
Because particularly we as musicians hate this. Again, understanding what that really means. I'm kind of an etymology kind of person. I love how things grow to be. But the root words of the word perfect, really come from to do and completion. And when you put that together and understand, and I can't take credit for this, one of my colleagues actually enlightened me to this, but I latched onto it, because when you take the idea that to be perfect is simply to have done the thing fully, then you know what? I'm pretty darn perfect. If I've gone out and I've played my recital and I've touched a couple of people, even if I messed up that run, and it really changes things. So when it comes to affirmations, my affirmation is about, can this be done completely? Am I that inspiration can be in this world? Well, okay, yeah, it can be. And we have to see evidence around the world for that. So this is terrific. We're good. So just do it to your full potential. And it is perfect. And what your full capacity is when you're a 20-year-old music major might be different than when you're 45. But that doesn't negate that it was perfect when you did it at 20 as well.
What a perfect way to finish, because, I learned so much talking to you anyway, Rik, but that last word about the word perfect and the etymology of that, it says it all, really. And you are going to come back on. The word being, if you can just be when you're on that stage, you can unlock so many jewels in your toolbox. But being, it starts, as you say, when you're sat. Interesting, we are so similar. In the morning, when I let Mouse out, my Bedlington Terrier, when she comes back in, she sits on my lap and she curls up and goes to sleep. And I just be. I am just there. And I'm just conscious of what's going in, but I just choose not to hook it. So we do very, very similar things. And the importance of just being to musician is so, so important. So let's cover that on another one.
Love to. And we also, I think, talked a tiny little bit about confidence, which I think is a whole other conversation to have too, because I think that's wrapped up in a lot of what we were dancing around today. I think that's in there too. And I'd love to have those conversations with you. This couldn't have been more enlightening and more fun. This was just brilliant.
Oh, I love the idea. I love the. It's my pleasure. Oh, my pleasure, actually. No, for me, the word confidence, again, you'll be able to give the etymology of that. But for me, there's a fine line between confidence and arrogance. And then how we, do we have to put a mask on to actually be a musician? So it's going to be a great discussion, that, Rik.
I love it. Jean-Paul. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you so much. What's your weather like today? It's going to be nice and sunny in LA, isn't it, as always?
Yes, it's to be lovely today in LA, and it's sunny.
Hasn't it? Isn't it always in lovely LA? People won't be able to see me. I'm now sticking my tongue out. It's cold and wet here in the UK.
Yes, well, my own family does, because they're still back in New England. So.
Oh, well, thanks again, Rik, and wishing you a beautiful day ahead and a musically fulfilling week.
Likewise. Thank you so much. This is just a fantastic opportunity. I'm utterly thrilled, and it was just great to talk with you.
So many thanks to the fabulous Dr. Rik Noyce for joining me today, and to you all for listening. May your week be musically perfect, and may your top E, yes, fourth octave E, be achievable and in tune. Goodbye, all.
Goodbye.
Talking Flutes and Talking Flutes Extra are podcast productions by the Trevor James Flute Company. For more information, visit trevorjamesflutes.com.